All right, AGOA down into day 2 now, all-important summit that's taking place at the moment. Dan Moyane, you're out in Nasrec. I'm babysitting the show for you today, just keeping the seat warm. But the real conversations are where you are today. You heard from the health minister earlier. You were focusing on health, and I know you're going to be talking to an expert now about how AGOA, and I think the word you used is how to counteract the influence of China in Africa. And I think that's what a lot of people are wondering, Dan, because let's not forget, not long ago we had BRICS taking place in Sandton.
Yeah, welcome back to AGOA here at the 20th edition of this AGOA forum at Nasrec, Gareth. And thank you very much for keeping the seat warm for me there in Hyde Park. Indeed, I mean, the South Africa, though, is viewed as Africa's gateway to investment through both AGOA and the EU trade programs, because South Africa is viewed as being a resilient country, and its economy is resilient. It's got some deep markets, and of course we are a constitutional democracy. Now, this forum that's taking place in Johannesburg this year, it's ending tomorrow, today being day 2, is aiming to explore ways to make the trade agreement, which started in 2000, more effective and beneficial to African countries. But how is America using this? Is it really to counterbalance the growing influence of China on the continent that we've seen over the last 2 decades? Let's discuss this and more now with the director of the Institute of Social and Economic Research at Rhodes University, Professor Nhlanhla Mbatha. Prof, good afternoon and welcome to today here on eNCA, talking AGOA. I saw your opinion piece and a very interesting point you make among several others, and I'd like to begin with it, is that AGOA is a tool being used by the United States to promote, one, social democracies in Africa, but also to counterbalance China's influence. And is that really the sum of it?
Yes, I would tend to argue that that's the case. Although technically and formally AGOA is thought of as a trade liberalizing instrument, but you can see in the conditions behind AGOA that the underlying political aims are to ensure that African countries are more democratic. I mean, some of the outlined conditions is that we have to have plural democracy, we have to have rule of law. So, you know, these are characteristics often of a liberal democratic society. And if you don't meet any of those conditions, then you don't qualify for AGOA benefits. And AGOA is passed in Congress, and American politicians or Congress has to make sure that their money, you know, goes to where their values are aligned with the country that receives its benefits. So yes, I would definitely argue that's the case.
So it's not simply a trade or economic development instrument. It's also got this political tool to shape the political conditions of on our continent. Beyond 2025, what do you think can happen or should happen? Africa wants this to be renewed, extended. The sentiment we're getting here at the forum this time around, it's a minimum of another 10 years. Should Africa insist on different conditions, or America will continue to use it, particularly currently, because we see China's influence is also growing, and Washington would like to counterbalance Beijing?
I can say that for a change, African countries, especially those that are current beneficiaries in AGOA, are in a much better position to negotiate the renewal of the arrangement. And you are right; it's because of the inroads that China has made in Africa in the last 25 years. Whilst America insists on these very transformational conditions to have African countries more democratic, more competitive in their markets, insist on the rule of law and other conditions, you know, the competing forces do not have those extra additional transactional costs for often poor African countries. So it is now up to America to make sure how they compete with competing nations or competing forces on the continent to ensure that they meet their political goals through AGOA. So in the short term, obviously for this forum, I mean, the discussions are more at a technical level on how to make the current arrangement more effective, how to ensure that countries that are benefiting are taking advantage of all aspects of the arrangement. You know, there are various obstacles towards many companies participating in AGOA. So part of it is just information, but there are also some, we call them non-tariff barriers to trade, whatever logistics or rate tapes there are. Also just not being aware that the products that you can export to America would attract no tariffs. So it's at the moment, you know, the discussion is really around technically how to ensure that the benefits are maximized. But I think going forward, there has to be a rethink and a more revolutionary type of an arrangement from America's perspective for them to be able to counterbalance the other trading competitive forces that are influencing the continent right now. China being one of them, BRICS, definitely. So, you know, I always think that in the short term, maybe what Americans have to think about is how to separate the trade aspect of AGOA from the political aspect, because I don't think that they're competitive enough in terms of the politics, the political requirements. But then I wonder whether or not Congress would be able to support an approach like that. But ultimately, for the long term, really, America has to deal head-on with BRICS, head-on with China at a global level for it to be competitive on the continent.
So keep AGOA strictly trade and commercial, and find another tool to use or other ways of managing the political relations. But just on African countries, those who are beneficiaries of AGOA, you said they have an opportunity now to structure or revolutionize how AGOA would be beyond 2025. Is this mainly around the conditions that, or the conditionalities that come with AGOA?
Yes, I mean, currently African countries face no tariffs. So economically, they face no tariffs or no taxes exporting their goods. And I'm actually talking about companies who are residing in the countries whose ministers are negotiating the terms of trade. So I mean, you can't push your benefits, your economic benefits below zero tariffs. But for political ministers themselves, for their countries to qualify, yes, I think there's room to start negotiating some of those conditions with Americans, especially now that America is under pressure currently from the competing forces. So for South Africa, definitely, you know, chances of the agreement being renewed are much greater than possibly any other country on the continent, given the fact that South Africa already is a constitutional democracy and its markets are very competitive, which is, those are two of the main requirements to be beneficiaries in AGOA.
Okay.
But for other countries who may be struggling with some of the conditions, the time, I think, is now for them to take advantage that America is not at, it's not at its strongest in terms of negotiating the terms of engagement.
Now, tell me, there's another point which I've raised earlier with other guests I've spoken to here on eNCA this afternoon at AGOA Forum, is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Is there an alignment with that and AGOA? And if so, how can Africa use it?
Yes. The Africa Free Trade Area Agreement is aligned, obviously, with WTO as other agreements. It's part of liberalization, trade integration, and that's what Americans are also aiming for, as well as the Europeans And I think that more so than with for example, the way that we're trading with the Chinese, the free trade, the challenge to the Africa Free Trade Agreement is the fact that many of African countries are not developed to an extent that they can have diversified products that they can trade with one another. Most of the goods that we're trading are at a very basic level, no value added to them. And so most of the products have to be exported outside of the continent, for example, into China. But what AGOA is, for the long term, trying to do in terms of economic development is to ensure that there's more diversification, there's more industrialization on the continent, and that would benefit the continent, and it would also benefit the Africa Free Trade Agreement, because there would be more goods being traded across African borders amongst the African countries. And it's not the same with countries that only just require, only import raw goods or natural goods like minerals from the continent, and continue to keep Africa just exporting raw materials outside of the continent. So the Free Trade Agreement is more aligned with AGOA and the EPAs in the EU than it is aligned with the approach that the Chinese are taking in dealing with the continent.
Okay. Yeah, no, thank you very much for your time and your insights and analysis this afternoon here on Today on eNCA. That's Professor Nhlanhla Mbatha. He's, of course, the director of the Institute of Social and Economic Research at Rhodes University. Gareth giving us some analysis and some views about AGOA and how Africa can make use of it. Very interesting point he makes, though, is that South Africa is in a much better or stronger position than many of its African counterparts to get a renewal with ease of AGOA with the Americans, but that the Americans are competing against China, and China's interest in Africa are protected by much lower kind of requirements in terms of engagement. So the Americans have to rethink as well, and as they want to extend this, how they could really make sure that AGOA is strictly trade and commerce without really any political conditionalities that are put into it. We'll have to wait and see what's going to happen. It is day 2 today. Tomorrow will be the last day of the 20th AGOA Forum meeting here in Johannesburg. Back to you, Gareth.
Dan Moyane, thank you as always. In a perfect world, no politicization of AGOA and BRICS and all these agreements. That's not always the case, though. But as Dan says, we'll wait to see how this plays out once pen is put to paper. All right, when we